quickly become the best gardener in your community. That's our, I guess you said that's our story and we're sticking with it, but that's our experience. I've been a Mittleider for 38 years. I worked personally with him for over 25 years, and in 1998 he turned it over to me. Everything, all his materials, and the challenge and directive, if you will, to carry on his work, to carry it to the world. Since that time, I have done my best full-time to do what Jacob was doing so amazingly well throughout the world. Give you an idea of the quality of this situation, this growing method and system. This is a university campus on their agriculture college. I was teaching there for 4 months, and one of the professors that was coming into my classes occasionally, he didn't attend all the time, but he heard me talk about fertilizers, and he asked if he could do an experiment and compare what we were teaching with what they were teaching down there in that country. And I was happy to have him do that. He used his students to plant these seedlings that were all the same. And then he fed my row according to my directions. He fed the other 2 rows according to what they were doing. One of them was an organic mix, and the other one was 16, 16, 16. After a couple of weeks, it became pretty obvious which was better, and after 5 weeks, about this time, he was begging me to start feeding his plants. So that's kind of what we found, wherever we've gone. We've got a video of a big project that I did in Madagascar on a government facility there. We established a school, and toward the end of that 3-month course, I took my students on a field trip to what was supposed to be the best agriculture station in the country that was run by their government, and also a school, a private school that was supposed to be teaching agriculture the best that they had in their country. If you ever get a chance to see that video, David has it on YouTube, and I think it says the Madagascar Project. We also have some of them today at the garden, but you'll be bug-eyed the way you were with those cabbages as you see how our gardens compared to what they were doing down there. My best student became the professor of the class and ultimately became a college professor. So that's the kind of thing that you can do on the high end of this. This is the garden that I raised in Alabama, Birmingham, and the soil was so bad that I had to use a pickaxe to get every plant in the ground. So that gives you an idea of what can be done even in the worst of soils. That's our promise. Great garden in any soil, in virtually any climate, with no soil elements. Sound like a big brag? This is what Jacob saw when he went to one country. And that's what he did with it in a matter of one growing season. I'm going to show you some things today that I hope will have you excited to do this in your backyard. This is what was being done in another place. And that's what he did with it in one growing season. Your growing conditions are tough here? How about blow sand? This is Santa Clara, west of St. George. And that's what we did with it there. So what's your challenge? Hopefully not as bad as a couple of those that I've shown you, but this is what you can do if you will learn to follow the recipe and protect against the elements. Now, you see this here. This is tomatoes grown vertically. That's my garden at Utah's Hogle Zoo. And this time I decided that I was going to make it in the garden greenhouse. And so 2 adjacent rows of tomatoes with T-frames tied together with a 2x4 at each T-frame, and then arched PVC over the top. I put plastic on that about the first week of October and grew tomatoes into December. So that I would like very much to see some of you folks doing that. Doesn't take a lot of money, but that will extend your growing season a month to 6 weeks in the spring, because you can cover that and start your seedlings inside there. And then, of course, another month or two in the fall. The blow sand garden, one day's harvest. And here's a city girl with no experience. She became the expert in her country. Tell you more about that. You will see that lady today. She's my mother-in-law. And she was an accountant until a terrible earthquake destroyed all the businesses and most of the buildings in their city and put her out of work permanently. When I married her daughter, we started going back over there to Armenia and made her learn how to garden because we needed her to be our representative. At first she hated me, and now she kind of likes being a high mucky muck. Great lady. So, there are dozens of gardening methods, as you all probably know. Back in the day, when my grandparents were young, there was kind of pretty much only one. It was called manure, and the best you could do. As a matter of fact, that's how I learned to grow gardens. I was 12 years old when my folks assigned me the job. I was the oldest boy at home. And I had to milk the cow, muck the stalls, take care of the chickens, and all of that. Lucky for me, I guess, my mom entered one of my pumpkins in the state fair, and when I won a prize, why, that kind of kept me going. But the difficulty we have today is that one person, one grower can feed 150 people. So 149 of us generally don't know very much about gardening. How many of you have gardens? Wow, this is terrific. How many of you consider your gardens highly successful? Okay, well, not as many, but we've got some. This is great. We're kind of in a farming community here, although with all of the building over the last 10 or 15 years, I suspect there are fewer farms than there were. But you probably have access to manure. Yeah? If you want it. Okay. Well, how many of you have heard the statement, chemicals are bad? How many of you believe chemicals are bad? Okay. Let me just disabuse you of a little bit of misinformation. Everything in this world is chemical. Everything. Everything in this world is chemical. To a chemist, everything's chemical. To a geologist, it might be mineral. But everything is chemical. So then, can chemicals be bad? Are chemicals by definition bad? The problem we have, you see, is ignorance and the fear that comes of ignorance. When someone makes a statement like that, a broad statement, that colors our perception of everything that comes after. And very often, we get led down the wrong path in the belief that that foundational statement is true, when in fact, it can't be true. Because chemicals are chemicals, and everything is a chemical. So if you water your lawn, you're watering your lawn with chemicals. If you're watering your garden, chemicals. So another statement that's similar is organic and natural are synonymous, and that's good, and that synthetic and dangerous are synonymous, and that, of course, is bad. And I hope to clear some of that up as we go along today and help you understand the true relationship between those things. So let's just take a quick look at some of these gardening methods. French intensive double digging, you just have to dig 18 inches through the entire garden. to make that one work. Square foot gardening, I suspect most of you have heard of that one, since he parked at Thanksgiving Point for a substantial amount of time. And lasagna garden, this is a fun one with many levels: compost, manure, straw, fertilizer, etc. The fertilizer being, of course, manure. Alfalfa hay. And then there's Back to Eden, another one that teaches that if you grind up the trees and let them sit for a couple of years, then you can plant in that mulch and grow a healthy garden. So, what we'll do today is we will strip down gardening to its true, essential principles. And those are the laws of plant growth that we'll talk about today. You don't have to write them down right now. We'll come back to that and discuss them one by one. But first, I want to talk to you briefly about Dr. Jacob R. Mittleider. Does anyone in here consider themselves knowledgeable about Dr. Mittleider, his methods? Have any Mittleider growers? Okay. We're virgin territory, as they said. And I went backward. This is what he has done. He authored 10 books and 9 technical manuals. These are widely used throughout the world today, some of them in colleges. He has developed and marketed a scientifically balanced natural mineral fertilizer formula. Non-toxic, produces healthy vegetables, flowers, trees, shrubs, lawns, anywhere in the world. And it is used in many, 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 many countries around the world. I'll tell you how he did that and why it is so good. This is how he started. Farm boy in Idaho, hated farming, vowed he did not want to be a farmer, and so he took baking in the Adventist boarding school, became a baker, a good baker. He got a job in Loma Linda, California, moved there with his wife and 2 children by this time. And one day, being a little bit of a hothead, he got in an argument with the manager of the store, took his apron off and threw it over the manager's head and walked out. So he was out of a job. The only other thing he knew how to do at all was growing. And so he then went back to growing and started growing flowers. He picked the brains and read everything he could, picked the brains of the good growers, put a soil scientist, Matkin Soil Labs, on his payroll, actually a monthly retainer. And over the course of 20 years, he became so successful that he was shipping his plants across most of the United States. He had created and earned 11 plant patents. He made a lot of money and done a lot of good, but he was about to lose his life. As the doctors took out half his stomach, telling him that he didn't have long to live at the rate he was going, he had a conversation with his God. He was a devout Seventh-day Adventist, and he promised to do something better with his life if God would extend his life. He was 43 years old at that time. God gave him another 43 years. And Jacob basically devoted all of that to blessing the lives of the world around him. Here's what he did. Sold a business. Started by visiting 24 countries. Took 6 months. And he came back from that trip convinced that a major, major part of the cause of sickness, illness, short life expectancies around the world was poor nutrition. And that the plants that they were growing were the contributing factors to that, because the plants were not healthy, the people could not be healthy. And so he went to the people at Loma Linda University and said, I'm ready to do something, put me to work. We need to change this. They then sent him to one of the scariest places on earth called Papua New Guinea. Those people had been cannibals. They were always warring, one tribe against another, and the winners would eat the losers. It was so bad that as many as 90% of some of those villagers were dying of a horrible disease called the Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. Anyone know that by a different name? Mad cow disease. Perhaps you've heard of that one. What is that? Why is it called mad cow disease? Because animals get it and they die. Why do they get it? Because we have made cannibals out of our animals. By taking old, sick cattle, grinding them up and putting them in the feed of the next generation. It was a bad practice. And it was outlawed a few years ago when there was a big outbreak of mad cow disease in Britain, and the whole world quarantined their meat. Well, Jacob saw this, the effects of this firsthand, and he learned for himself the dangers of using animal byproducts. By the time he got there, they'd actually stopped the practice of cannibalism, so the people weren't quite so ferocious. But still, it was a very difficult thing. He was 400 miles inland from the nearest airport. It took them a week to get there over these terrible roads. And this is, of course, what he found in that what should have been a paradise, because it never froze, never snowed. They could grow year-round, and yet this is what he did. Now, this is the first of many big projects that Jacob did. He actually conducted 75 humanitarian training projects, schools, things like that, over the course of 37 years in 27 countries. This was the first. And what he started out doing was growing on the ridges on those 30-inch centers. Do we have any tractor farmers in the audience? We have someone here that knows what that's about. Those measurements are for the convenience of the tractor, so they can get up and down the roads. And this is what Jacob did, and he planted on the ridge so that the plants wouldn't get flooded and die when the rains came or irrigation or whatever. Massive improvements, just tremendous changes very quickly. As a matter of fact, the picture you saw before will tell you a little more about it. These are the same guys you saw in that first picture with their war paint and headdresses on. They become civilized, and we're learning, and we're becoming Christian, actually. But they were starving when he got there, and it took them 22 months to grow 1.5 tons of sweet potatoes on an acre. Jacob, in 10 months, grew 15 tons on an acre. So he increased their yield more than 20 to 1. Changed the economy, changed the country. The boy, his name was Silas. He was Jacob's yard boy, putting himself through school. Silas today is known as His Excellency, Sir Silas Atapari, President or Governor General of Papua New Guinea. Back then, there weren't any Christians to speak of on that island nation. Today, more than 10% of the population are Adventists. 25% of their parliament are Adventists, because they're educated. I've had LDS missionaries tell me the Adventists own Papua New Guinea. Why do you suppose? He did amazing things there. 3 years they lived there and changed that country forever. He did the same thing in Africa, 4 different countries. This was Kennard, one of his students, and that was his garden before the class started. 6 months after the class was over, that was his garden. Kennard was a rich man, and I'll tell you that in a second. But first, let me just talk about changes in the growing. Notice these T frames there, how the tomatoes would be grown vertically. Doesn't look fancy at all, but it was a huge, huge improvement over what he had had before. This is a 5-foot wide bed, solid cabbage. By the time Jacob visited this man in his home, Kenneth, who would typically see $20 in a year, had sold $575 worth of crop, cash crop, and was still in the middle of his harvest. And by the time Jacob came the next year, he was teaching 80 other farmers. Zimbabwe would have been the breadbasket of Africa had their government not stepped in and taken away the farms from the good farmers like Kenneth, given it to people who knew nothing and cared nothing, and then destroyed their currency. Now it's the basket case of Africa instead of the breadbasket. They had a chance because Jacob was well on the way to putting them the same way he did Papua New Guinea. Third country, and by the way, there are 27 of these. I'll only bore you with 5. But these, I think, are typical. This is an island off of the north coast of South America. Is that me? Trinidad and Tobago. These folks, the farmers, were leaving their farms and going to the city because they couldn't grow anything in this terrible caliche soil. And this is what Jacob did. Today, I have farmers from Trinidad talking to me on a fairly regular basis. The biggest farmer, most successful farmer on the island, has told me that there are several hundred Mittleider growers on those 2 islands. They're the only ones making any money. And now, instead of having to import food like they did when Jacob came, they export food into South America and all the way north to Miami. Changed the economy of that country. 4th one quickly. Okinawa. City of 1 million people. They had no room to grow. All they had was a driveway, patio, flat roof, window box. Jacob very quickly taught them that they could grow in those situations by creating a garden on a concrete parking lot. He then taught the farmers how to grow in their steep hillsides. He changed the economy of Okinawa and was honored by the Okinawan and Japanese governments as well as the U.S. military, who was involved back then. The last one I'll tell you about, perhaps the biggest and most important of all. Russia, 1989, communism. Mr. Gorbachev was doing something called glasnost and perestroika. Don't know exactly what they mean, but it was an opening or a reawakening, opening to the West and some of the things that were happening in the rest of the world. And they allowed the Adventist Church to create this small college on the proviso that they do an agriculture program as a part of it. So they gave them this little scraunchy place to start their garden. It's underwater, so Jacob quickly put in a French drain. Then he cleared it, and whereas before they were eating 4 or 5 vegetables, cabbage, potatoes, carrots, and beets, and making borscht, and that was kind of what they lived on. Very first year, he grew 18 vegetables, including zucchini that they'd never seen in that part of the world, and beans, etc., etc. Their agriculture agents, the communist agriculture agents, were so amazed or flabbergasted. They would come into his garden and they would steal his plants and tuck them into their jackets and leave. And they'd continue doing this for probably 6 weeks. They finally came to him and admitted what they'd been doing and said, "We've never seen plants like this. They're so healthy. Every time we've got a lush green looking plant, it's got nitrate toxicity. You got to tell us what you're doing." So then he was able to start teaching them. And they would send some of their graduating students from the 5-year university called Timorazy Academy in Moscow to his 3-month course. Those students would finish the course and they would say, "I've learned more about growing food in 3 months and I learned in 5 years at the university. The communist agriculture minister went on national television and said, probably multiple times, the only food grown in Russia that's fit to eat is grown in a Mittleider garden. They made Jacob the featured speaker at the Yalta Conference of Agriculture Ministers, honored him from Tbilisi University. His students would go back to their towns, villages, cities, announce a gardening seminar like this, and they would get 1,500 to 2,500 to their seminars. One day gardening, the next day the Adventist religion. Mid-90s, the nationalists who were trying to take over the government came out publicly and said, you've got to get rid of these Western religions. I don't know if any of you remember that, but they named the Mormons and the Baptists and the Jehovah's Witnesses and a bunch of the others. Seventh-day Adventists were never on that list. They were highly respected over there for what they've done. As a matter of fact, today, this system of growing is still the most productive and most popular method of growing in many regions of the Commonwealth countries. Changed the course of history. And God sent him there at that particular time, I believe, for that very important reason. Why? Because Mr. Stalin murdered 13 million of his own people, collectivized the farms, put the people into factories, and robbed them of their capacity to grow their own food. And when August of 91 came, that was a scary, scary prospect for those people who had lived 70 years under communism. The responsibility of freedom included figuring out how to grow your own food. But by that time, there were thousands of people out there, and people would be seen in the trains reading Mittleider's books and going out to their dacha to grow their own food. God did something else about that same time to help prepare those people for throwing off the shackles of communism. June 91, 6 weeks before the fall of communism, God sent his choir to Russia. I had the great privilege and blessing of being a member of that choir, and we sang to those people in their own language about the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man, and the reality of the Savior Jesus Christ and his atonement for us. And when the time came, and the communist masters told the soldiers to shoot those protesters, they refused to do it. And that is why communism fell. Great blessing. Great, amazing thing that you'll never see in the newspapers. I know it is real because I was there and saw it happen. So, 1998, Jacob entrusted his work to me. I established the charitable foundation, Food for Everyone Foundation. I published the Mittleider Gardening Course and book that I consider to be the best gardening book on the planet, without even a close second. I digitized his body of work and made everything available on CDs and on the internet, as well as hard copy. I conducted training projects in developing countries the way Jacob did, learning how to do it the way he did, and hopefully approaching the quality and level of his work. Created the internet presence with a URL and with some gardening groups. Growfood.com is where you go to find these things. Very simple. Growfood.com. And for the past dozen years or so, I have been conducting gardening seminars like this around the world. Basically around the country. We haven't done it in other countries this way. But these are free group seminars wherever we're asked if the people can get it together. So here is a picture of me with the country LDS Humanitarian Services country director of Madagascar and the garden that we created there with the training school. You saw the picture of the vegetable comparison that we did, that was in Colombia, Popayán, Colombia, the University del Cauca. And this is the garden that I and my students and I created in that country. By the way, after 4 months training, these students committed 20 hours a week for 4 months. And when they finished, 5 of them were hired to be the agronomy teachers in the schools in that city. So that's my garden in Alabama again. The reason you all are here, I suspect, probably the same reason I am. God gives commandments. And this is what he said. Every family should have a garden. And then he said, grow all the food that you possibly can on your own property. Grow vegetables and eat those grown in your own yard. Even those residing in apartments or condominiums can generally grow a little food in pots and planters. And I believe those words were inspired, but they're even more relevant to us today than they were back then. Because of the world we're living in, we often don't know where our food comes from, do we? Nor what is in it. So it becomes more and more important for us to grow our own. I had the blessing and privilege as a humanitarian services missionary for the church to create some gardening materials for Provident Living. You can still find that on providentliving.com. They've taken it down and I'm showing nothing on providentliving.org. I don't know why. But let's talk about 6 steps to successful gardening. You all were given some handouts. Anyone did not have those? If you signed up for the class, you should have received an email, and all of those would have been available to you on that email. David is bringing some copies of the 6 steps schedule. This is something I think you would be advised.
I'm going to interrupt for just a second. Rock's here. If you just raise your hand if you need some handouts.
The lady in the beautiful outfit is my wife,
And I'm going to ask you
Roxia.
a couple over here. Walk down there. This is a great attendance. I want to thank everybody. We've got a couple of housekeeping things while we're passing those out. How's the weather in here? Good? Okay, good. Please turn off your cell phones, put them to vibrate, taser, whatever it is, so it doesn't rain. And we're going to have